Welcome back into the Beyond Pain podcast. I am one of your hosts, Joe Gambino, and I'm here with the other host here, Joe LaVacca. You can find us on Instagram. I am at Joe Gambino DPT, and LaVacca over there is at Strength and Motion _ PT. You can find this podcast on Instagram, Beyond Pain Podcast, and on YouTube, Cups of Joe _ PT. I think I nailed it there, Joe. Welcome back.
You have been nailing it. You're on a solid streak, and it really is just because you took out a lot of praise for me. It
Which
kept
shouldn't
you on
have
your
been there in the
game.
first place, you know?
Shouldn't have? Is that what you just
Yeah,
said?
yeah, yeah.
Shouldn't
We're
have?
bringing it the other way now, Joe. We're bringing
Hey,
it the other
man,
way.
look,
We got to
you
look
did
round
that.
angle.
I didn't ask for that. You did it, and then it was
I
just like
know.
a nice thing. It was just a nice thing that you were doing, and I looked forward to it. I think the listeners looked forward to it, and now it's not there anymore, and we're just all wondering, if and when it'll ever come back.
I don't know, man. It's streamlined. It's quick. It just flows nice. I'm not searching for it. So
Right, right, right.
here we are.
Oh man, what's going on? How was your week? Everything going good in the clinic? You save anybody's life this week?
I did not save anyone's life this week. Clinic life is not too bad. I actually have someone in person in the community here, so I have them after this. So it's been nice to have a little in person time again. But otherwise, things are going pretty good over here. How about you?
Good, yeah. I've saved at least 6 lives this week, which is down from the previous weeks not meeting my current quota. Is the in person? That was the gentleman you were talking to us about, I think, about in one podcast with some neck pain or something like that in the community. You guys are training now in the
No,
garage.
no, this is a different person.
I'm growing that in person business in North Carolina. That's what we're talking about. All right.
Yep. So this is a different person, actually. With let me think of him on our elbow episode because he's elbow injury
Oh,
at
okay.
heart, and then we were talking about how can we do we address other areas, and then I did look at a lot from his shoulder after we did his mostly focused on his elbow for like probably like a month straight. I did a little bit of shoulder and hips. He has a lot of things going on. But I did more of my manual stuff and shoulder focused on that session, and it made like a huge impact on his elbow. So goes to show, even though it seemed very, very much so like a very typical, a tendonitis, tendinopathy at the elbow, the shoulder did play a huge role in it too. So
Oh,
you never
very
know.
cool.
Yeah,
Yeah, you never
very cool.
know. That's why keep an open mind, check everything, find what matters, all the normal things that we talk about on the podcast. And today we're talking about something exciting too for those in the industry or even not in the industry. The big story this week was obviously Jason Tatum's Achilles injury, and it was very devastating. Obviously, you never want that to happen to anyone. In the context it happened to him in a playoff game, he's
Hmm.
scoring 50 points. I kind of like Jason Tatum personally. I think he's a really good player. He sort of I'm not saying he is, but he sort of like reminds me a little bit of Kobe, and the way Kobe played. And again, just so we don't get hate mail, I'm not
I
saying
was gonna
Jason
say, but
Tatum
watch yourself.
is
You're
Kobe
saying he's
Bryant.
better, right? You're
Yeah,
saying he's
well,
better than Kobe.
no, no, to be determined. To be determined. No, no, but no, I do like him as a player, and it was fun to see him go back and forth, even though he was playing against my team. But naturally, and I'm sure you saw this, everyone started talking about Achilles injuries
Hmm.
and his training and what we could have done for preventing things. So we're going to talk a little bit about prevention. Can we do that thing? Can we screen people? Do we know what to look for? What are the base rates of injury? So let's just start general. What is your opinion on injury prevention and how much people should be focusing on something like that with their rehab or prehab or anything else?
Yep. So I think when we look at, I mean, you can't the word terms injury prevention. I know that's buzzwordy. You see it all the time on social media. But prevention is impossible. I think, regardless of what you do, how you train, you can do everything perfect in the world. You will never escape the risk of injury, right? You can do the best that you can. You can reduce, I believe you can definitely reduce your risk and you can make your body more resilient and tolerant to stresses and forces. But at the end of the day, especially even at, I mean, for anybody, but especially at the NBA level or any professional sport, where they're putting their bodies through a lot. Like, those things are bound to happen to some people at some point. You don't want to see it happen to, some of the top players in the game and some of the most pivotal moments. And that, when you're in the playoffs and you're trying to make a push and you get to the finals, probably would have been even more escalated if this was the finals. All of a sudden, I think it would be even more talked about at that point. And we see it. I've seen it in football a bunch of times where injuries happen. All of a sudden, now rules to the game start to change. So we might start to see that happening here at the NBA level now with this going on. But like I said, injury prevention is not really a thing, but we can do our best to mitigate injuries. So you can tell me what you think on that if you want to add anything. If you do believe prevention is true.
No, I don't think so. And yeah, then we sort of go into those like little conversations of, well, if we can't prevent, maybe we can reduce. And sure, maybe that is the case. However, I do think that we also overblow a lot of our screening tools and then give people maybe a little bit of a false belief. Well, if you just work on your hamstring strength, or you work on slowing down your knee with your jump, or you work on this, you work on that, that you aren't going to get injured. And I think that's the wrong message. Now, of most of the things with injury prevention I've seen or read, it seems more effective when you establish this at a team level rather than an individual level. So you want to get everyone on the team prepared. You want them to work on certain capacities. Fine, I get that. If you've already had an injury, though, then yeah, maybe the way you land with your jump mechanics can potentially help you. But the number one reason why people get hurt again or at all is previous injury. And I'm always reminded of the idea of the vulnerable organism model from Louis Gifford. If one thing is hurt, the whole organism is going to behave differently. Now, just for recency bias, Tatum did sprain his wrist in the previous series when he fell. I'm not saying that's why he tore his Achilles, but it is an interesting correlation where, hey, one part of him was already a little bit hurt. Now he has an injury in the next series. He could not have prevented either one, in my opinion. And I think from what I'm hearing, your opinion as well. But I kept seeing all these different ideas. Some people were on our side. Hey, you know what? This is just life. It's bad luck. It's bad luck. You play a sport, you have to accept the injury risk. And I did a little research. What do you think the injury risk for NBA players suffering Achilles injuries is year to year?
I'm going to say 1 in 1,000.
It's pretty close. It's pretty close. About 2 to 5 of them happen per year. And there's 450 players in the NBA. So that means that 0.2% or 0.4% of NBA players every year are likely to suffer an Achilles injury. Your point before is that you just don't want to see it happen to the guys you love. Other than Jason Tatum, do you know who else it happened to this year?
I haven't followed basketball enough to answer that question.
All right. Well, some big names. Damian Lillard was just also a couple weeks ago in the first round of the playoffs, right? So now we have 2 Achilles injuries to 2 superstars in the playoffs. And then what are people saying? The season's too long. We need it. We need prevention. We need management of load. Okay. It was 2 people. Wouldn't everyone else playing and not suffering an Achilles injury sort of like disprove that point? It also happened to DeJounte Murray. DeJounte Murray, this was in January 1st of this year. So middle of the season, how do we explain that one? James Weissman of the Indiana Pacers, his was October, right in the beginning of the season. Maybe he wasn't prepared. And then we have another one on Drew Smith. I've never heard of Drew Smith before, but again, I don't follow basketball that much, and his was in December. So we have 2 in the beginning of the season, 2 at the end of the season, 1 in the middle of the season. How does that help us with load management in the NBA? I don't think it does. So when we're coming back around to all this stuff, if you're going to play basketball or soccer or football, there has to be just certain injury acceptance or risk acceptance. And there's not going to be anything that we can do to mitigate that. But what if I told you I had a program that would reduce injuries by 50%? Would you sign up, Joe?
Yeah, absolutely, I would. I mean, we talked about on this podcast launching our coffee infused collagen that's going to stop all injuries from happening ever again.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
where we're at. But I think it's also made even worse with the Curry injury, and there's a few other notables that are out. But I think actually talking about with Tatum having like an injury previously, very recently, and then into the Achilles tear. This same thing happened to McCaffrey late in the season, and everyone was like, he's playing in snow, blah blah blah. But dude had like a knee injury the week before, I think, and then he ended up having it was an Achilles tear, right?
For McCaffrey?
Yeah, or was it a
I
knee?
think
I
I
forget
think
if it
he
was a knee
just
or an Achilles, but
I
he
think he
had
just
like a
had
major.
yeah. He had just
Yeah,
like I think it was just chronic Achilles tendonitis.
he
I
did,
don't
yeah.
think
So
I don't think
he
he
had
ever
at the beginning of the
tore.
season, but he had no. Let me Google this real quick because I feel like at the very end of the season, that snow game, he had a major injury.
Is it McCaffrey? Yeah, one of the guys at the
Yeah,
gym
yeah,
is a big 49er.
PCL, season-ending PCL injury. So yeah, and I think a lot of it had to do with right around that time he had like a little bit of a flare of something, and then he had like missed half the season or more than half the season with the the foot ankle tendinopathy, whatever we want to call it. So I mean, it's part of life, again, especially at this level. But let's bring this to, we can talk a little bit more about screening, but I kind of want to bring this into, if this was just, someone listening to this podcast who's a runner dealing with some issues, or someone who's lifting with, how do we bring this into, people who are not professional athletes, and what can they do from a injury prevention standpoint, or we call it injury mitigation
No,
as we're
or
trying to lower risk
preparedness.
here. Yeah.
Preparedness is the word that I usually use in the clinic with everyone. Again, that just is the McCaffrey example you brought up is another perfect example of previous injury leading to another injury.
Right. I remember
And
like the first thing you learn in school is like the number one risk factor for an injury is previous injury, right? So like, and I used to tell people that all the time. I mean, I still do. But I think it's something that people really need to kind of keep in the back of their mind. If you had a ankle sprain once, the chance of it happening again goes out. If you had a client who dislocated his patella, it happened more than once. Right. So just keep in mind, if you do have one, chances are, I mean, at least the risk of it happening again is there.
for, I think, people listening, broad strokes, I think a lot of the things that we end up building as adults start and end really in childhood. So I think that, or this has been shown, our tendons are going to be as healthy or built up as they are by the time we reach adolescence. And then those are sort of the tendons that we walk through with life, right? Probably to some degree, bone density is correlated to that just a little bit. This is why I think it's so important that we don't over specialize in any one thing too soon. Run around, play, jump, skip, hop, mix it up. There is nothing that I believe or have seen, and especially I think when you look at all these athletes, a lot of them were really good high school, we'll stay with basketball, were really good high school football players. They were really good track athletes. When you read the resumes of these guys, none of them were really like, oh, I only played basketball from the time I was 5. That was just the sport I chose when I got older because that's the one I showed, the most competence in, the one that I could excel at. For people listening, especially if you have younger kids, try to push them to do different things. Don't have them focus on just one sport all year round. And that's something I see all the time in Long Island because you have your fall team for soccer and basketball, then you have your spring team for soccer and basketball, then you have your travel team for the summer. And it's just a lot of the same repetitive stress. People who are now moving on, they're like, well, can't go backwards in time. I really messed that one up. Well, don't worry, I did too. So now what you have to sort of figure out is stick to the basics. And these are conversations I've had with more and more people in the training program here at Strength in Motion. Some people like to do as many reps as possible. Some people like to do every minute on the minute. Some people want to cross train. Some people want more rowing in their workout. And I'm like, look, that's great. You want to row? Row. You want to put together a little circuit? Then blend everything together. That's fine. But stick to the basics. Rinse, repeat. Fall in love with that process, because so often the exercises we see people do on Instagram are underloaded, they're on unstable surfaces, and you're kind of getting good at a few different qualities, but not great at any of them. And I think what really a lot of this stuff comes back to is people are just afraid to load themselves heavy because they don't want to get hurt. Well, what do you think is going to hurt you when you go out in the field of life or sport? Load. So the more you can load yourself, the better. So that's what I would sort of advise people. Mix it up, load heavy, but stick to the basic.
I like that. And I would say, we're looking at programming over time, right? I mean, sure, I think a lot of people have different goals. Someone might want to go run, a marathon and hit a specific time. Some people may want to just be able to, not have back pain when they're playing golf. Some people may want to be able to go out and compete at a powerlifting meet, right? So, hey, you always need to know your goals, and understanding kind of what demand you want to place on it. Two, I think you should train in whatever way. I think like when we're looking, if you look at people tend to look at programming in a small, okay, this is my month, so I'm going to program it like this, and they don't look at the whole big picture, right? So if you're training, let's just use powerlifting, you'd say it can be anything, and your meet is on this day, and you need 16 weeks to really prepare for it and kind of peak and then hit your meet and then move on from there. Now you know that around this meet, this is going to be like your central training for performance for that. Right after it, you're probably going to want to do general preparation to make sure your body's feeling good after kind of putting your body through the ringer. So I think having like just a this goes back to the basics. It's a basics program. It has some mobility. It has some general strength. It has maybe some energy system work, but it's just the basics. You're not trying to overdo anything. You're just trying to like kind of like undo some of the hard pushing that you've done. Give your body some recovery in a sense, and then you can switch that up to whatever else that you needed. If you have some goals, maybe you go back into a strength block because you're trying to get the numbers up for the next meet that's coming on. And just start to kind of build that base a little bit more, or it's a hypertrophy block, or it's maybe you put on some weight because you were trying to be a little bit heavier for that meet. Then maybe it's a weight loss block in a sense where you're trying, so you just look at the kind of goals over the year and you can kind of break it down that way. And if someone's just very, very general, then pretty much the way that I look at it, if they're just like, I just don't want to have back pain when I'm playing golf, it's, hey, like, so we'll just do things here and there, but like we still have times where we're going to train you harder. And then we're going to have times where we step back. Sometimes where we focus more on mobility. Sometimes we focus more on hypertrophy. So it's just kind of, I think people just need to kind of take a step back and look at things from a bigger picture and not just here and then now. And then just focus on the basics, do some strengthening, do some mobility, try to improve any imbalances that you have. And I think the stronger we can make you, the more mobile we can make you, it will help things in the future as far as reducing injury, especially recovery. I think is a big one that a lot of people miss. It's not just massages and stuff like that, but are you sleeping? Are you eating? Are you hydrated? Like those things can go a long way too. Talked about it last episode, right? Like someone was drinking, right before they went for a round, that can contribute to back pain, right? Because they're not hydrated, drunk, all of that stuff, right? So at the end of the day, I think if we're focusing on the basics and things like that, it should help, but again, we're just trying to reduce your risk of injury. We're not making it never happen again. I think that's a lot of people need to know that because people do things right, and then when something happens, it's a big mental hit for them, and then it takes time for them to kind of get over it and build that confidence. Just like, oh, why me? I think there was a phone call with Tatum, and they put on it was on Sports Center's Instagram where he had a conversation with his dad, like, why was it me? I'm like, he's doing everything. Like, he has good trainers. He puts work into his body. Like, why did it happen to him in that moment? It's mentally hard. It's going to probably take some mental work for him to get back and be ready for when he is ready to get back on the court, to be able to
Yeah.
trust that ankle, to push it, to play.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the same for you and me or anyone else who gets an injury. That nerve is getting back into activity.
I mean, grief is part of the injury process.
Mhm.
You just lost something that's really important to you, and you're going to be out for a significant period of time. And that's your identity. So if you weren't grieving or didn't have that moment of anger, I'd probably be a little bit more concerned. I'd be like, well, yeah, if Tatum popped up, he's like waving to the fans, giving a thumbs up, in the wheelchair, you see him, he's like, just waving at everybody at home, like, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be like, well, I don't know. Does this guy really love basketball? Should I have bought his jersey? Should I have bought his shoes? So I do think that that is part of the process. And I don't know how old Tatum is. Tatum's pretty young, right? He's younger than 30 for sure, I think, right?
I don't know. You keep talking, and I'll let you know.
Yeah. But, age is another one that
27.
comes 27. Yeah. So, I mean, from a standpoint of, being in the peak of his career, previous injury, I don't know a lot about Tatum's previous cycles or really a lot of athletes' previous cycles if he had any Achilles or ankles injuries before. Now, if Brunson tore his Achilles, you and I might be like, well, yeah, I mean, the
It's
guy's
bound
rolling
to
his
happen.
ankle, yeah, every 3 minutes, I mean, so it kind of makes sense. But for Tatum, you're like, oh well, I don't know. Did he have any other issues? And we wouldn't even know. He could have been dealing with some Achilles issues throughout the season, and he's taping it up, or just like a lot of tendons do, they feel better after you keep loading them. So who knows? Maybe he was taking some medication for his wrist. Who knows, right? So I think that the big takeaway for a lot of this stuff is prepare yourself as best as you can.
Mhm.
Stick to the basics, but then realize that there's always going to be a risk. And the people selling you injury prevention programs and all these other different things, even if they have data that says, hey, I'm going to reduce your injury risk by 50%. Well, look at what we talked about with Achilles injuries. They happen 2 to 5 per year. So even the best program is going to reduce injury risk to 1 to 3. I don't, is that a valuable program to sort of be implementing and buying and going across everywhere? Well, yeah, I guess if your guy didn't get injured, but how would we ever know that he did or wouldn't or she wouldn't? So it's
So,
interesting.
Terry, I'm going to bring you back to your point. I actually pulled up here. It's his injury history. And back, first one that's on here is 2017 ankle injury. That led, he looked like he was pretty good in 2018, 2019. He has shin injury. He has knee injury, groin injury. 2020, the ankle comes back up. 21, ankle. That lingered around. 22, ankle injury. Bunch of knee stuff popping up in here. 23, he had a couple of heel injuries, also an ankle injury. And then that leads us into 24, where he started with an ankle injury, knee, and that kind of led all the ways to this season, where he did have an ankle injury earlier in the season, and then here we are today with the Achilles tendon injuries.
Okay, right. So again, like amazing, right? Like I didn't even know any of that. But now all of a sudden, if you're betting, right? If you're looking at injury risk profiles for Tatum, you're not going to be like, oh, you know what? I think his back's going to go out this season, like Ben Simmons's back goes out, right? No, you're looking at his list and you're like, well, geez, ankle, 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 heel, shin, ankle, ankle, heel, shin, and you're like, I really hope that nothing happens to him lower body, ACL, Achilles, but then it did. So, I think again, it's interesting. The other little conversation, again, that people I was thinking about this week, and I wanted to ask you this, and maybe even ask this to listeners. The shoes that he was wearing, right? I saw some videos of like them cutting it open, and he has that fibercarbon plate in it, and that fibercarbon plate's designed to help explosiveness, maybe by 2%, whatever that means, and it does put a little bit more stress on the tendon. So even if there was a correlation to these shoes or these super shoes, I'm thinking that there might be a dip, right? Where you and I are going to wear super shoes with our shitty tendons. So yeah, maybe we're not the best people to be wearing super shoes. However, if we put Avery and Olivia in some super shoes and had them run around and jump and everything at a younger age, would that extra strain and stress on their tendon actually help them reduce injuries later on? So are we just like using the technology in the wrong direction where for you and me, it's like, hey, you know what? Just use your regular Converse. Like you're old. All right. Like you didn't do this when you were younger. and then maybe put some of this newer stuff into the adolescent group and then say, hey, look, if we can get these tendons as stiff as possible earlier on, these shoes are going to help that. And then would that reduce that chance of it happening later on? So that's what I was been kicking around this week.
I mean, it's definitely an interesting conversation because it's the same thing that we saw with the whole barefoot craze. You know, it's like someone who's barefoot their whole life never wore, cushioned shoes. You know, if they were to wear a Vivo or get into this barefoot style shoe, they're probably going to be able to transition really well. Take someone with foot issues. Like I never really had foot issues, but the first time I wore Vivos, my feet were sore as hell. You know, it was like such a different stress, right? And it took me some time. And they even tell you when you buy them, right? You need to acclimate to these shoes, right? Like you can't just go in and walk around on the concrete for hours and hours for weeks on end in these shoes and expect not to feel sore, to have some discomfort or anything like that, right? So, I think that kind of insinuates at your point. I don't know if we want to be messing around with adolescents and say, hey, try these carbon fiber. Let's put these insoles in your shoes and see if it increases tendon load down the line. But I think the more that we allow people to be barefoot and walk around and use their feet naturally and get out of these shoes, I mean, that in itself could potentially make impacts down the line. But again, we also live in a culture where someone's been wearing restrictive. Basketball players have their ankles taped probably almost their whole life at this point, from when if they play high school ball, college ball, and then at the professional level, ankles are constantly taped. They're wearing specific basketball shoes. Does that also have an impact on some of these injuries that happen down the line as well? I mean, we can make correlation here, but I don't know if we'll ever have the answer to all of
Yeah, and we don't even have to do anything to the adolescent. We don't have to put anything in their shoes because all these shoes have these things already.
that.
Like, for you and I growing up, we were getting a pair of Jordans, but they were just, as far as I knew, regular rubber, regular material. If you date back to, our parents' generations, what Dr. J was just in some Converse. I mean, those basically were probably equivalent to barefoot shoes that we have today, right? So that's where it's interesting, where like this technology is running so fast, so far. Is it just, again, like this middle age characters who are trying to retrofit themselves into this new technology, and we just never prepared our bodies for it, and then maybe that's where this little correlation of higher injury risk, or the seeming correlation of higher injury risk, maybe is coming into play for some people. So I thought it was interesting. Maybe we can have one of um a foot person. Maybe we could bring Cord or Jen or somebody back on, talk to us a little bit more about sneakers and footwear choices and things like that for viewers and clients. Yeah, I think it'll be an interesting question or conversation to think about, when to apply these things. Would they matter earlier on versus kind of later on in life? Things to kick around.
Thanks, Nick. It's actually interesting. I would actually love to see a further date back, but apparently the injury rate this season is double last season. So that is an interesting change, and I wonder what would make that big of a change in 1 year. So again, I mean, when we're looking at these things, I think I haven't looked at the trends enough to say like what happens in the 19s versus now. I mean, the game is different. I don't know if you can even make a correlation between how players played then versus now because people are faster, bigger, stronger than they were many decades ago. But I think if we looked over maybe like last 5 to 10 years and we're constantly seeing an increase, then maybe that's the case. But again, training has changed significantly. People again, I mean, you look at players from LeBron was probably like one of the people that came on, when he came is strong, athletic, right? Like more and more players are coming up now. That's like Zion, like that didn't exist, 15 years ago in the NBA. I feel like there was a major shift in almost all sports with size. What was that book? Was it Homo sapien that we read? I can't
Say,
remember the
say,
name. Sapiens. Yeah, where they talk about, like body types and like their specific body types for sports and how they've changed over time. So it's clearly been, you're almost like cherry picking, right? Like people
Correct.
now that fit a certain build that are going to, work better in this sport versus another sport based on their wingspan, their size, their height, things like that. So definitely interesting. And again, we can make correlations here, but there's a lot of things that have changed year over year. So I think it's gonna be really hard to pinpoint one thing versus the other. It just goes back to basics, Joe. Just go back
That's
to
it.
basics, do what you can, and hopefully you're one of the lucky ones that can get through seasons with minimal injury.
Look, and there's a good chance you probably are. Just weigh the risks. You probably are going to be okay. But if it's not, or you're not, then there are ways that we can probably try to help you. But even if, again, when we're playing with small numbers, this is where it gets, it gets headline grabby, because you and I can research. Okay, well, what was the injury risk last year? Okay, well, it doubled this year. This year there was 5 documented cases. Last year that means that there were probably 2 or 3 documented cases, right? So double it, it's still sort of in that estimated incidence of 2 to 5 per year. So yeah, we can cherry pick small numbers, and I think this is what our profession sort of likes to do, and then run with it and be like, well, why are injury rates increasing? It's like, well, it kind of stays around this number. Now, if next year it goes from 5 to 10, and then the year after that it goes from 10 to 20, well, then yeah, that's a big correlation, right? Because over here, yeah, it has risen a bit, but it's still, over the last 20 years or so, the average is 1.7 per year. Yeah, maybe it went up from 1.2 or 1.3 or 1.4. And again, I think it's more polarizing the more popular the player is. So you have Klay Thompson recently, right? You have Kevin Durant recently that sticks out in my mind, and you watch that replay over and over and over and again. But if it was a second string guy, you don't know them, maybe we're not even talking about this as much. It's just like, oh, because you can always say the second string guy didn't work as hard. He wasn't as strong. He wasn't as fast. He wasn't as this. And then I saw some post this week that was like, well, the reason why these happen is because human beings are just exceeding, the capability of their tissues. We're at such a high level of human performance. And I was like, that's the dumbest shit I've ever heard. Because then all we have to do is watch baseball players. Your UCL, that ligament on the inside of your elbow, should technically explode every single time you throw a baseball. Now, granted, like, UCL injuries happen, but they're not super common, right? So if we're exceeding the capability of our tissues, and our tissues were never meant to do this, well, then we shouldn't have been able to throw a spear or a javelin, bringing up Sapiens a while ago, because we would have been like, oh, our ligaments can't handle that. But they can, because force is nonlinear. So that's also an interesting conversation maybe we come back around to. But I think we've said a lot today.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say here is that this season is not the highest percentage of injuries across all seasons in the NBA. 2020 was.
Interesting. So COVID, the lockdown, change in
Yeah,
schedule, maybe some of these guys were recovering from illness. So cool, like really interesting things to talk about.
injury and illness is part of that number, so it's not just injury. Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, there
Fun
we.
facts, Mr. Gambino.
That's it. The power of Google. Power of Google. All right, man. Well,
Yeah.
I don't have anything else to kind of add in here, so you can
Yeah.
take us home if you have nothing else.
Yeah. Well, this is a great conversation. Thank you, Joe. I love you. Listeners, we love you. And don't forget to come back next week for another exciting episode of the Beyond Pain